I feel great honor and exhilaration introducing a distinguished professor, Shakespeare scholar and translator, who worked not only on Shakespeare's sonnets and plays, but also on Candan's selected poems. Professor Dr. Bülent Bozkurt was my first dean and my first guiding leading professor in my undergraduate years and graduate years at Bülent University. I was acquainted with the term serendipity as he was lecturing on Chekhov in the World Short Story class and never forgot about the term, in accordance with Chekhov's writing since then. Professor Bozkurt's scholarly interest in Shakespeare was materialized through his doctoral dissertation on Othello and on the idea of tragedy in Renaissance. He wrote it at the Shakespeare Institute at Birmingham and Stratford-upon-Avon. He taught at Hacettepe University till 1986 and became part of the academic community here at Bülent University the same year, where he taught courses to graduates and undergraduates mainly on Shakespeare, Renaissance, metaphysical poetry, translation, and mythology. Travel literature is among his research interests, apart from the areas stated above. In collaboration with his dear wife, Associate Professor Bülent Bozkurt, he translated Shakespeare's complete sonnets, 12 plays, and Candan's poems. From 1986 till 1996, he worked as the Vice-Rector for the Student Affairs and was the Dean of Faculty of Humanities and Letters till 2005, the year he retired. Almost all the books that are about 1,084 in number we have at Elite Library, the list of which can be found via the department's webpage, were donated by Professor Bozkurt. We toil to proceed in action with the great responsibility of being true to the trust we borrowed from him. I'd like to thank him for his initial efforts in establishing the department and for accepting to be with us today. I'd like to express my gratitude to Professor Talat Halman, who is in New York now on sabbatical leave, and who suggested inviting Professor Bozkurt as the first honorable speaker of the seminar series. I'd like to thank Professor Varol Akman, the acting dean, who supports Elite Department without any impediments and reservations. Now, please heartily welcome Professor Bülent Bozkurt, who is going to talk about Shakespeare's eternal lines and intriguing characters today.
This is a computer model apparently based on Shakespeare's existing likenesses. And it also proves how little we know about Shakespeare's image, how he looked. In this image, a somewhat distressed-looking Shakespeare seems to be gazing at eternity. Here's my title, Shakespeare's Eternal Lines and Intriguing Characters. And the first line here I borrowed from Shakespeare's sonnet number 18, when eternal lines, time thou burst. Shakespeare is still with us, and still counting. Of course, we don't know what portion of eternity, over 400 years, forms, but nevertheless, he is with us. Shakespeare's dramatic genius lies in his masterful fusion in his masterful fusion, among other things, of such elements as language and imagery, character, plot and structure, and themes. Therefore, it would be misleading to overemphasize any of those elements in isolation. That's what I seem to be doing here. Keeping that consideration in mind, I shall touch upon some aspects of the interrelation of language and character in Hamlet, Macbeth, and King Lear, without attempting to pass a comprehensive judgment upon Shakespeare's act. I shall refer specifically to the curiously confusing identities of the three great central characters in these plays: Hamlet, Macbeth, and Lear. By far the best known of Shakespeare's memorable characters is, of course, Hamlet. To be or not to be. What a sensationally appealing man. Breaking language barriers, becoming common, if not commonplace, if not a commonplace expression, in unlikely languages, such as Turkish. Take, for instance, this comment in the sports section of a popular Turkish daily, Habertürk. This is in sports. These are the sports pages of Habertürk. The date is 17th of October 2012. The commentator on these pages refers to a game of the Turkish national football team as, in literal translation, a to be or not to be match. One more, not you. Incidentally, the game turns out to be a not to be one on the Turkish side. He could have said a matter of life and death, but prefers the philosophical connotations of Hamlet's line, no matter how awkward it sounds in the context. Philosophical is the key word here. Hamlet, the intellectual prince, seems to have inspired millions of people with his vague but strangely effective philosophy, largely thanks to the forceful language of his soliloquies. One wonders whether he has struck a suicidal vein in human nature. Yet, there are other sides to this enigmatic prince. On the stage, he is variously represented as a tender, sensitive, noble, dignified, amiable, romantic, passionate, and philosophically minded person. However, the altogether positive image evoked by those traits is not quite justified by some of his speeches and actions in the play. Right after his to be or not to be speech, he insults and victimizes Ophelia, telling her roughly and cruelly that he never loved her. Get thee to a nunnery, he said to Ophelia. Why wouldst thou be a breeder of sinners? Let us remember that in Elizabethan slang, nunnery would also mean a brothel. Then Hamlet embarrasses and humiliates her, Ophelia, in the company of the king and the queen before the players perform their dumb show. in Act 3, Scene 4, on an impulse, he stabs and kills Polonius with his sword, mistaking him for Claudius. Then he dismissively calls Polonius a rash, intruding fool. What's more striking than his casual attitude here is that at the end of that scene, he leaves the stage hugging in Polonius. Perhaps it's a technical point. I don't know if it's there. By treating Ophelia in the way he does, and killing her father, he causes her madness and eventual death. Later in the course of the play, a menacing rather than sensitive and tender Hamlet coolly sends his former friends, Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, to their death. Obviously, he is not against killing. Nevertheless, he refrains from keeping his promise to his father's boss that he would kill Claudius. The fact that he happens to do so in the end seems to be only incidental. Hamlet can be sensitive, dignified, tender, and magnanimous, but he's at his best when he's speaking, using deeply poetic and emotionally expressive language here. These are all a selection of Hamlet's memorable lines. The mirror up to nature. And here we see Hamlet reckoning with man's state and, of course, death. Wishing to disappear from the face of the world, or that this too solid flesh would melt, without exactly committing suicide, without getting himself killed by someone else. He just wants to disappear. One Shakespearean character manages to do this. Exactly this. But not Hamlet. He is Lear. He simply dies in the end. And here we see the magnanimous Hamlet. Use them after your own honor and dignity. So, no trouble for him in speaking. Thus, using his eloquence and rhetorical skill, Hamlet manages to disturb Claudius and Gertrude, intimidates her mother to distraction when he bombards her with accusations, and makes us contemplate questions of existence through his soliloquies, which convey the tender, earnest dignity of a tormented hero. It is first and foremost this image of a sensitive noble, of a keen mind, an agile wit, and a meditative philosopher which remains stamped upon the minds of generations of playgoers and readers. It is no wonder that, throughout the stage history of Shakespeare's play, Hamlet in Britain, the success of actors representing the enigmatic personality of the prince, as well as those of Macbeth and Lear in those plays, has often depended upon whether they were able to preserve the poetic appeal of the verse. The success of actors representing these characters often depended upon whether they were able to preserve the poetic appeal of the verse. Macbeth has often been impersonated on the stage as a savage, cruel, cowardly and pathological criminal. However, in 1962, the Canadian actor Christopher Plummer confused American audiences as a Macbeth who became progressively more noble and self-aware. Such an interpretation might seem odd, but Christopher Plummer had found his clue in Macbeth's famous lines in the latter stages of the play. Here, Macbeth finds himself in a moment of agonized soul-searching in deeply ironical terms. Especially noteworthy is his ambivalent attitude towards life and death, echoing Hamlet's "to be or not to be" saloon. Let us remember that all these three central characters, Hamlet, Macbeth, Lear, had to reckon with death in some way, at some stage in the course of each play. Here are the lines by which many of us remember Macbeth. It's in such lines, indeed, that Christopher Plummer must have found the clues for his interpretation of Macbeth. She should have died hereafter. Impressive, although ambiguous, we still don't know what exactly it means. And then, Macbeth's most famous lines. Life is but a walk in shadow. Poor play. It's a tale told by an idiot full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. Who could believe Hamlet, Macbeth, after hearing and reading such lines? Obviously, a few lines such as these of psychological insight and an occasional meditative aside would not make a saint of a murderer. Yet again, who could deny the force of such suggestive lines as these, uttered in such style? King Lear's distinction lies in the way he speaks, such as like Macbeth and Macbeth, but also in the way he dies. Wisdom eludes him, but he's exalted by his poetry and his uncommon death, to say the least. He's the only Shakespearean character to die on stage with a sheer intensity of emotions. This is a fitting end to a terrifying play, in which Shakespeare explores, especially through his lyrical language and astounding imagery, the extremes of human suffering. and the fragility of human existence, and offers no explanation or consolation. The figure of Lear overwhelms us with the scale of his physical and emotional journey as he is progressively stripped of his crown, his regal authority, his reason, basic human comforts, and finally ordeal. Here one recalls Edgar's paradoxical dictum earlier on. The worst is not, so long as we can say, this is the worst. Ironically foreshadowing the latter stages of Lear's journey, when Lear looks like anguish personified. At the beginning of the play, Lear wants Cordelia to praise him in a better way than her sisters have been able to do. What can you say to draw a third and more opulent than her sisters? Speak. Nothing. What makes Lear an especially memorable tragic character is the poignancy and profundity of his depiction of human suffering. Such as this bound upon the wheel of life, mine own tears do scorch. His depiction of human suffering, almost unparalleled in Shakespeare, perhaps elsewhere too. In the end, his mental deterioration often a precursor to death in Shakespeare, and the build-up of emotional and physical suffering he undergoes only needs a final stroke, only needs a stroke for his final exit, and that stroke is provided by the death of Cordelia. When the play opens, King Lear of Britain proposes to divide his kingdom, his realm, among his 3 daughters, giving the largest share to the one who describes her love for him most eloquently. The rash and insensitive king seems to have already made up his mind. And is sure of the outcome of this contest. He thinks that his daughters will simply try to outdo one another in their attempts to express their adulation of their father, and eventually he'll award the largest share to his youngest daughter, Cordelia, whom he declares that he loves best. He is, however, stunned by Cordelia's curt refusal to play the game in the way Lear has anticipated. tragedy is triggered by the conflict between the unwise king and his uncooperative daughter. At this stage, Lear is an arrogant, testy, and rash old king, perhaps with little tragic potential. Only after he gets mad are we afforded glimpses of the awakened humanity of the spirit, suffering affliction, especially by virtue of his touching eloquence in moments of crisis. In a sense, Lear grows in stature even as he deteriorates mentally. At the end of the play, he dies of sheer surfeit or emotion, the only Shakespearean character to die of grief. Lear just ceases to be. Perhaps at some stage, Hamlet would have liked to die the way Lear dies. This is a way of dying, of course, Hamlet refers to by implication when he says in his soliloquy in Act 1, "Oh, that this too solid flesh would melt." Lear's solid flesh melts in the end, in essence. We can always find these curious interconnections between Shakespeare's plays, between characters and their actions. No matter how often or how hard Hamlet thinks about death or non-existence, he is incapable of ceasing to exist in the way Lear is. In Macbeth, Markham says, referring to the Thane of Cordova, "Nothing in his life became him like the leaving it." The same might be said of Lear, although obviously the context is different. Nothing in his life became him like the leaving it. Lear's is a superhuman, primeval, terrifying way of dying, with far-reaching implications about the state and fate of humanity. Lastly, Hamlet, Macbeth, and Lear gain tragic stature and fame predominantly by what they say in contradistinction to what they do or are capable of doing. They rise less by their deeds than by their diction.
Thank you for your inspiring talk, Professor Bozkurt. Shall we take some questions or comments if you'd like to?
Hello. The line about the flesh that should melt or would be best to melt. Of course, there's ongoing debates about the instability of Shakespeare's texts and how it can establish what it was that he actually intended. But in the juggling of the quartos and the folios, I thought that it had more or less been settled upon by scholars that in fact he says sullied, in other words dirty, rather than the flesh being solid. It is in fact, it's contaminated, dirty quality that makes him want to, as it were, get rid of it. And I'm not that kind of a scholar, so I don't really know how the scholars arrive at that decision, but somehow they've arrived at favoring the sully rather than the solid.
That's a point. Editor seems to be undecided whether sully or solid.
Well, I thought that they were back and forth for a while, but it seems to me that more recently that sully has been gaining the vote pretty definitively. But in any case, even if they are juggling it, it does sort of, I think, lend a little bit of ambiguity to the whole quest for finding Shakespeare's eternal lines and the way that they gain their particular reputation, if they are in fact sort of changing. So in other words, if Shakespeare can produce something enduring, that we find enduringly important, whether he said solid or sully, despite the fact that they're two very different words that have very different implications, is it not perhaps the fact that Shakespeare gained by various expressive powers our willingness to assume that, his various phrases have a kind of unquestionable power that we continue to celebrate, even though the lines themselves actually change quite a bit as we move through time and as editors make different decisions about how they should be rendered.
Of course, we don't know what Shakespeare intended. And my only selection, I could have taken as other examples of Cleopatra, Caesar, and others. To make that point clear, I wanted to focus on these three characters. And again, I don't know whether I'm answering the question or not, but in the beginning I provided this caution that Shakespeare's plays, as most plays are, a fusion of elements. And Shakespeare's is often a masterful fusion of elements. Therefore, it is risky, dangerous to single out language, character, or one or two passages. So I'm aware of the implications of what I've chosen.
Very much. In your final sentences, you actually emphasize the way in which Shakespearean tragic heroes speak, that makes them tragic. So, could we say that they are overreaches in that sense as well? Is that what makes them tragic as well?
I don't know. They rise in some way. I don't know whether they become tragic only by the way they speak. Only by the way they speak. And overreaching oneself might lead to stupidity as well. I think Shakespeare wants to say, to generalize that human beings are never so simple. Can never only be ambitious. Conduct is not a magnanimous, benevolent philosophy. He could be both. Both a philosopher and a murderer. Hamlet is a philosopher murderer. Macbeth is a murderer philosopher. And they all find ways of reckoning with death. So again, what happens if we take away Macbeth's famous lines about and say about 10, 15 lines from the play. The best lines, let's say. What happens? Then perhaps a much worse play, and Macbeth becomes a simpler person. Not only a wicked person, but a simpler person. And again, I'm a bit cautious about using these, because if we say if, then we're doing something unreal. We are separating these lines, or part of Macbeth's personality, from his overall image in the play. So, do they overreach themselves? I think they are part of their character, not overreaching, but being simultaneously at one and the same time, both a murderer and a thinker and a soul-searching person. And that's what distinguishes Shakespeare.
I'd like to thank you all on behalf of our audience, I suppose, and I'd like to give you a sign of our gratitude, which will not be eternal, perhaps, but another one, of course, which you'll keep. So if you can help me with you to present our gifts to Professor Bozkurt.
In this close this on a more positive note. I find this modern science fiction image of death rather cute than somber. Nothing to do with Shakespeare.
Please help yourself outside. You're going to have drinks, some refreshments, and you may talk over drink to Professor Bozkurt.